Hey everybody, this is Retro Game Core. I just got back last night from CES in Las Vegas, and I spent about a week there just kind of going through all the different booths, talking to a bunch of people in the industry, and so I wanted to do a recap video here today, talking about some of my favorite things that I saw and some of the things to look out for here in 2024. And I was surprised to find there were a lot of things very relevant to this channel, including a new handheld PC, which I did get my hands on. And so in this video, I'm going to go over my top 8 or 10 things that I saw on the trip, and I think you'll get some pretty good insights as well. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, I think we should start with probably the biggest announcement that was there, at least for this channel, which was the MSI Claw. And this is an upcoming handheld PC that was announced by MSI during CES last week. And at first glance, I think this handheld looks a lot like the ASUS ROG Ally. It has the same general size, same speaker placement, button placement. Even the software itself was very reminiscent of the ROG Ally experience. The screen is also very similar, 7 inches, 16:9 aspect ratio, 1080p resolution, and a 120Hz refresh rate. Now, I also asked the team whether or not it was variable refresh rate, and they said yes, but you have to bear in mind there's a language barrier when talking to some of these folks, and then also they didn't seem very sure of themselves when they said it, so don't take it from me, this isn't gospel fact, but they told me yes, but I had a little bit of hesitation with that answer. Either way, I really do hope that it has variable refresh rate because I really like having that in a handheld PC. Now, there are some things that are different from the ROG Ally, including the battery size. This one is 53 watt-hours compared to about 40 watt-hours with the Ally. And then also, even though the controls looked similar, there were quite a few differences. To start, the face buttons felt nice. They have a glossy texture to them, but they're very tight in the shell, which is a very good thing for me when it comes to a nice controller. They also have an RGB backlighting, and so you can kind of adjust those colors, which is kind of neat. The D-pad's also similar to the Ally in that it has a soft click, but it's not quite as clicky. You don't have that clicky response as you do with the Ally. And the analog sticks have Hall-based magnetic sensors, but also feel very light to the touch. I kept describing them as being a little bit flicky. And also bear in mind this was not a final product, and so some of these elements may change. Up next were the shoulder buttons. These had a bit of a mushy feel to them compared to the Ally, but still felt pretty good. And then also the analog triggers were magnetic Hall sensors. These also felt very good and had a pretty shallow travel to them. I actually like that with a lot of devices. It gives it a more hair trigger kind of feeling, and so I actually like that feeling. Now, this device also has back bumpers that are programmable, and I didn't really like the feel of these. They were a little bit more intrusive, like they kind of got in the way of my middle finger, and they also didn't give me a ton of room for my ring finger and pinky. So for me, it felt a little bit cramped on the back, and I wasn't really expecting that. But other than that, I thought it was a pretty well-made device. The ergonomics were very comfortable. The sides are rounded a little bit more than the ROG Ally, which I appreciated. And it's also very balanced and lightweight feeling. In fact, when I first picked it up, I thought it was lighter than the ROG Ally, but turns out it's 60 watts heavier. So I think that goes to show how well balanced it is. Now, this device is also the first major handheld PC that's been released over the past few years that has an Intel Core processor. And so that's kind of a big unknown. I'm not really sure how that's going to perform. And yeah, we played a couple games while we were trying it out, but everything was very early software, and so I don't want to make any judgments in one way or another, but I am very curious to see how this is all going to work. And in the end, I only had 3 major red flags. These are things that I'm going to look out for in my final review. Number 1 is the plastics. This is a black device that has a bit of a matte finish to it, and as it goes with most of these devices that are that color, they usually are prone to picking up fingerprints. Now, the company says they're using the same kind of plastics that they use with their laptops. I've never really used an MSI laptop, so I'm not really sure how that's going to be, but at least from my initial impressions, it did seem to be just about as smudgy as any other black handheld. Another thing I'm cautious about is the power efficiency. This is of course an Intel chip, and I don't really know how that's going to work with a handheld PC, so we'll do a lot of real-world testing when I actually get my hands on a review unit. And part and parcel with the power efficiency is going to be battery life, and so we're not really sure how this is going to work out. I'm glad they have a 53 watt-hour battery, but I think the chip is going to need every little ounce of that. And then finally, another thing that I thought was going to be a red flag, but I'm not too concerned about, is the micro SD card slot. The positioning is very similar to the ROG Ally, and as you probably know, that one had all sorts of issues with like overheating the SD card. Now, they're very aware of that on the MSI side, and so they've done a couple different things to kind of help with that. Number 1, they've kind of distributed the airflow away from the micro SD card so they don't expect it to get very hot, and they put a ton of ventilation on the back and the top. So if anything, I'm hoping that the MSI Claw will be a bit of an upgrade over the ROG Ally. There's a lot of unknowns, especially when it comes to that chipset, but I am pretty excited about this one. And so as soon as I can get my hands on a review unit, which I hope MSI will send out to me, then I will absolutely make a full review on it and tell you how it's going to be. Anyway, I feel like I've been talking just as much about the ROG Ally as I have been the MSI Claw. And so let's pivot over and start talking about the ASUS booth and some of the products that I saw there. Now, on the PC side, they didn't have a lot to talk about with the ROG Ally. They had some AR glasses they're working on that were actually there plugged up to an Ally, but other than that, everything was about like computers and monitors and laptops and things like that. And on the computer side, there was something interesting in that ASUS is now in charge of the NUC branding. And these are going to be like small mini PCs, which you know I love to review on this channel. And they have a few things in the works. To start, they have two different enterprise-focused NUC PCs. One is called the NUC 14 Pro Plus, and the other is the NUC 14 Pro Mini PC. And both of these are powered by Intel Core chips, and even though they are not really targeted towards gaming, I think that you could probably use these as retro consoles. So if you are looking for a mini PC and you want something from a larger, reputable brand, then these ASUS ones might be something worth looking into. Now on the gaming side, they're also working on something. They're calling it the ROG NUC. And this one is also powered by Intel, but had a discrete graphics card inside. Now it's a mobile GPU, so it's not going to be the best and brightest, but even then it can be configured up to the mobile RTX 4070. Now I'm not sure what the pricing is going to be on this. I assume it's going to be relatively high, but if you're looking for a gaming PC with a very small form factor and with an ASUS branding on it, this might be something worth looking into. Speaking of which, the company sent me a smaller PC just right before I left on my holiday trip, and so I'll be doing a review of this later on this month. And this one here is a full desktop PC, but it is very compact and small, so it's got a full GPU and everything. Now, in addition to the computer stuff, I also saw that there was a telescopic controller for mobile phones. And they're calling this one the Tessen, and it really felt like a Backbone or a Razer Kishi competitor. Some interesting things about this one is that it was actually foldable, so it could get pretty compact, and I really like the ergonomics on this. It had a more triangle shape to it, which felt really comfortable. And it also had an 18-watt power pass-through through the USB-C port, so that was pretty cool. I also thought the controls on this were very decent. The buttons were soft clicky, the D-pad was really responsive, it also had analog triggers, so overall I'm gonna keep a lookout on this one. I'm not sure again what the price is gonna be, but this one might be a pretty good telescopic option. Okay, sticking with the PC kind of theme, let's go over to the Lenovo booth and talk about what I saw there. And I was surprised to find that the Legion Go was nowhere to be found. I mean, this thing just recently released, but they had nothing to show about it, and they didn't have anything to say about it either. And if you remember from my review, I had mentioned that I really hope that Lenovo has different controller options. I tried to talk to their rep about this same idea, and they just kind of stonewalled me. They didn't really want to talk about it at all. And so my guess is they're probably working on something right now, but they're not ready to talk about it just yet. However, there were a couple things that were interesting in the Lenovo booth. Number one is they actually have an eGPU solution that they're working on. And this reminded me a lot of the Razer Chroma, which I actually own, but the cool thing about this one is that it has an Oculink port. And that actually makes it a really interesting prospect. You can essentially add your own GPU to this enclosure, and then with the Oculink port, you have essentially PCI speeds. Not only that, the power supply within the display model was 1200 watts, so it's going to be able to power just about anything. Now, the only unfortunate part about this is they plan on selling this as a package deal with a laptop that has an Oculink port in it. I think they're only selling one at this time. And so, of course, as you can imagine, I talked to the rep about that and I said, listen, you guys should really think about selling this as a standalone because there are a lot of mini PCs and handheld PCs that have those ports or are coming out with these ports, and it will really give us a lot of expandability in that sphere. And so I do hope they sell that as a standalone, because if you imagine you have a GPD Win 4 with an Oculink port, you can have a pretty powerful handheld PC and then plug that into that GPU and have basically a no compromises experience, and that would be pretty awesome. Another product that I thought showed some promise was the ThinkBook Plus Gen 5 Hybrid. And this was really interesting. It was essentially a Windows laptop, but the screen itself could be pulled away from the chassis. And when you did that, it still worked as a tablet with a screen. And that tablet was powered by Android using a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1. And so as a concept, I thought that was pretty interesting. You could use it as a Windows laptop, then pull it off and use it as an Android tablet all in one. So instead of having two different devices, it's basically just one together. Now, my excitement was kind of tempered when I heard the price point, which is around $2,000. Now, it is pretty cool to have a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 tablet and then also use it as a PC, but I'm not really sure about that price point. Okay, and finally, the last PC related booth that I visited was MinisForum. And these folks are a mini PC manufacturer. I review a lot of their devices here on this channel. Now, there were two devices that caught my eye, and unfortunately one of them I couldn't videotape because of embargo, but essentially it was a tablet PC. If you think about an iPad, it's running iPad OS and it has some limitations in the software side, and you essentially can use it for productivity, but most people will use it for entertainment. This one is a full-on Windows PC. In fact, it's a lot like their other mini PCs, but in a tablet form factor, and I think that opens up a wide range of possibilities. Number one, this thing is beefy. It has the latest Ryzen chip, which will be coming out here later, but then also a 14-inch screen, 16:10 aspect ratio, which will make it great for retro gaming, and then also a 1600p resolution. In addition, it's got, fans and a good battery. I think it's about 50 watt hours. So it has all those things that I would expect in a mini PC or a handheld PC even, but it has it in a larger form factor. So for example, there were a lot of people very interested in the Lenovo Legion Go because of its 10-inch and larger size, and the fact that they can kind of use it as a gaming tablet with these detachable controllers. And you can essentially do the exact same thing with this. In addition, they're really thinking about the other aspects it can be used for. For example, it works with like one of those touchscreen stylus pens, but then also it has a keyboard connector as well. So you could use it just basically as a full-on laptop. And I also tried out the keyboard function and it worked really well. In fact, the manufacturer of their keyboard is the same person that makes the keyboards for Apple. And finally, the last thing that really sealed the deal for me is its USB-C port. Now, this is USB 4, which means you can plug it into like an external GPU and have display out, all those things that you would expect from USB 4, but it's also capable of video in. So if you think about it, you could take a Nintendo Switch and plug it into this, and all of a sudden you've got a 14-inch screen. You could take your other laptop, plug it into it, or a computer or whatever. And I've never really seen a tablet like that that has video in natively, and so I'm really excited about that. Anyway, I totally asked them for a review unit when it's ready, and so I'll probably be doing a video on that here pretty soon. And finally, the other thing that I really found interesting from the MinisForum booth is a computer that's actually been out for a while, and I actually passed on the review of it initially, but when I actually saw it in hand, I was like, man, I gotta review this thing. And this one is called the EM780, and this thing is kind of crazy. It is a 7840U inside, so the same thing as a lot of the mini PCs or handheld PC that we've seen this year, but the size on this thing is just tiny. It's actually a pocketable PC, which is crazy. And so I've never really seen something like this, where it has a bunch of power and also in a small form factor. Usually there's a ton of compromises, both in size, but then as well as the power. Another thing I thought was really cool is that it had a card slot for microSD, which means that you could plug in like maybe an operating system like Batocera and then boot it into a retro console from the SD card. So that's pretty cool. And so for that one, I also asked for a review unit, so I'm hoping to review that in the next month or so. I do want to test a couple things like performance and cooling, so be on the lookout for that video too. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about some handhelds that I saw while I was there. And to be honest, this was not a huge focus of CES. There were 135,000 people in Las Vegas that came to that event, and I have to say that many of them were not there for gaming. Most of it had to do with VR and AR and AI, and so those are all topics that are interesting to me, but not really having to do with the channel. So let's talk about some of the handhelds that I did see while I was there. And let's start by talking about the MyArcade booth. Now, they had an Atari handheld they were working on. Now, unfortunately, this was behind a very dusty looking glass case, and so I wasn't able to get my hands on it, but it did look pretty good. It had the largest screen, I think it was about 7 inches, and it also has HDMI out, which was kind of interesting. It comes preloaded with, I think, 200 Atari games, and the rep that was there at the booth kind of insinuated that you could also sideload your own games, so we'll see how that goes. And the controls on this were pretty interesting too. It had a paddle and a trackball and a keypad, so there are many different ways that you can control those games. Now, to be fair, I don't think that my channel is like the target audience. I think this is more for like older generations, people who just want a plug and play Atari experience, and so I'm not really sure if I'll actually do a full review of this device, but it was kind of cool that they were working on something along those lines. Another handheld that was kind of interesting was the Hyperkin Mega 95. And to me, this one looked like a 2024 version of the Sega Nomad, but just in a kind of a 6-button controller from the Sega Genesis kind of style. And as far as I could tell, the only thing this did was play Sega Genesis cartridges. So there was no inbuilt software or anything else like that. You're not going to be able to emulate Sega Genesis games on this device. But there were some interesting factors to it. Number one, it had a USB-C dock, so you could plug it in and kind of consoleize it. So if you wanted to have a Sega Genesis replacement just in both handheld and well as a desktop form, this might work out pretty well. Now, Now, as a handheld gamer who really focuses on the nitty-gritty, I did notice a couple things that kind of made me steer away from it. Number one, the D-pad and the face buttons didn't feel quite like I was expecting. For example, the face buttons were pretty darn mushy and felt a little bit cheap. Same thing with the D-pad, it didn't feel as responsive as I was hoping. It was pretty mushy. In fact, I think the Anbernic RG Arc has a better D-pad than this one. And probably the biggest kicker was the fact that it had a 16:9 aspect ratio display, so all the games were stretched out. Now, I'm assuming they did this in order to keep the cost down because a 16:9 aspect ratio display is pretty easy to find, but all the same, it did look a little bit weird. So in the end, even though I love the Sega Genesis, I wasn't super stoked on the Mega 95. We'll see when it comes to retail and whether or not any of these things are improved, but as it stands right now, I wasn't super excited. Okay, so that was really about it when it came to handhelds, but one other thing that's kind of a similar topic are controllers, and I think my favorite aspect of that was the GameSir booth. Now, they had a ton of things they're working on, including a more budget-friendly controller that looked really good. In fact, this one reminded me of something like the 8BitDo Ultimate controller. And there's a bunch of different colors and RGB options that they'll have available for these, and it also will have various connectivity options, including Bluetooth, 2.4 gigahertz, as well as wired. Now, another controller I really liked was the X2S. This is a telescopic controller, so made for like Android phones and tablets, and it's an upgrade from the X2 controller that came out a couple of years ago that I really like. There's a couple things unique about this one. Number one, the USB-C port on it is on the left, and that's going to work really well with dual screen phones because most of them, when you fold them up, will have the port on the left side. And they're also going to have a Bluetooth version available if you don't plan on using that USB-C port. Now, as a controller, most things have been upgraded from the X2, including the D-pad and the face buttons, the shoulders and triggers, which are now Hall sensor as well, and analog. So really good improvements there when it comes to the X2. And it's also going to be at a budget price point around $50 or $60, so I think that's great. Now, one of the things I like about the X2S is that it has a more blocky look to it. So when you put in a phone, it does look and feel more like a retro handheld. And finally, the last thing that I thought was pretty cool is that this one has been designed to be able to pop open so that you can make it wider. And that's awesome because on their other telescopic controllers, you had to go and mod it, but they've actually been paying attention to that and just made it moddable right then and there. This means you'll be able to put a full tablet inside the X2. So if you have an iPad, even up to 14 inches, it's going to fit there. And I think that's pretty exciting, especially if you think about that MinisForum tablet PC that I mentioned earlier. And so I'm definitely interested in reviewing that one, and I think it's going to be launching here pretty soon. Now, recently I reviewed a GameSir telescopic controller. It was the G8 Galileo, and at the time I said this was the best controller that you could buy. And honestly, I think that for most use cases, the G8 Galileo is still the one to get. It has a more console controller kind of feel to it. However, I still think the X2S is going to have its own niche use case for those who want to take a phone and transform it into like a handheld gaming console kind of feel. And then also if you want to attach it to a tablet, I think it's going to be super easy and pretty cool. Okay, and finally the last booth I wanted to talk about was the XREAL booth. I've reviewed their AR glasses here previously, and they did announce a new model during CES. It's called the XREAL Air 2 Ultra. And the distinguishing factor of this one is that it has sensors on it. And so if you think about like the Apple Air Vision Pro or whatever they're calling it, it's very similar to that in that you can watch things and everything is going to stay stationary, and it's kind of like a mixed reality experience. So essentially, I sat down and I tried this out in a private screening, and they showed me a bunch of different use cases. For example, if you're watching a movie, the movie itself stays stationary on the screen, but you can still move your head around, so it kind of gives you that virtual reality kind of feel. And the sensors work in the sense that they pick up on your hands, and so you can make motions, like a pinching motion with it, and it'll pick up on that and allow you to select things. And you don't actually have to move your hand to pinch the thing. Instead, you can kind of keep it down below because the sensors will still pick up on it, and then you just have to look at the thing you want to select, and then you can pinch with your hand in a more comfortable position. And so if anything, I think they're trying to make like a budget version of that Apple one. This one is still not cheap. I think it's like $699 retail. So I'm not sure if I'm going to review this one. I think it's a little bit too high end on that price point, but it was interesting to test out that new technology. And so before we wrap up, I do have a lightning round of things I want to talk about, things that I saw and I'm planning on working on, just the various questions that I usually get when I make a video like this. Number one, everyone likes to ask me what device I brought, and I brought the Odin 2 with me. It just made a lot of sense since I was trying to continue the games that I was playing over Christmas break, including Sea of Stars, and I'm pretty far in that one. I think I'm around 9 hours at this point. I also had a great time hanging out with other YouTubers and content creators that came and are kind of in a similar space, and we all stayed at the same house, which was kind of crazy. So I ended ended up hanging out a lot with the Retro Handhelds crew and also Joey's Retro Handhelds, as well as Rob from the Retro Tech Dad. And there were definitely some shenanigans while we were there, including going to a barcade that we kind of stayed at for quite some time. We had a really intense game of NBA Jam, and then also played through a couple different Metal Slug games. That was a lot of fun. We also recorded a full 90-minute podcast episode talking about all the things we saw, so if you want to go into more detail about the things I'm talking about in this video, I would recommend that. I'll leave a link down below. I also should mention that I went to the Sony booth. There was not a lot to go on there, but they did have different colorways for the PS5, which looked pretty cool, and I did get to play Last of Us Part 2 Remastered. They didn't let me videotape it, even though it's like coming out this week, but either way, I did play it and it felt pretty good. Now, there wasn't a lot in terms of swag to show off, but they did give me a pillow from the ASUS booth, and this thing is like a little ROG Ally. I think it's pretty neat looking. My kids love it, and so that was the only swag that was notable that I got during the show. And then finally, you might be wondering what I'm going to be working on next, and I'm not really sure. You know, I went on a long Christmas break and then went to CES basically immediately after that, and so I don't really know what I'm going to be working on next, so let me know what you want me to work on in the comments below. The only thing that arrived while I was gone was the GK80 Pixel, and this is a small kind of Miyoo Mini competitor, and so I will test this one out. I'm not super stoked about this one because it has closed source software, but I've heard that some custom firmware developers are trying to hack into it to develop their own, and so we might have something pretty cool with this one, and so be on the lookout for this review video here in the coming weeks. Anyway, that's really about it for this video here. I just wanted to go over all the crazy things I saw at CES. I know this video was a little bit long, but man, there were so many things I didn't even talk about. There were so many things to see. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what your favorite thing was down in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.